The editor of Turkey Recap, Diego Cupolo, outlines Turkey's response to the U.S.-Iran-Israel war. True to its historical pattern, Turkey has sought neutrality, focused on mediation, protected its NATO assets and airspace, and guarded against a potential mass migration wave from Iran. Building on a Saudi-Pakistan security pact formed in 2025, the war has accelerated the emergence of a quadrilateral defense coalition between Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, united by shared concerns over Israeli regional aggression and the unreliability of the U.S. Domestically, Erdogan faces a difficult balancing act, as the war is driving up energy prices ahead of an expected 2027 election cycle.
So, hi, I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics, business, and foreign affairs. If you want more information, it's turkeyrecap.com. I'm here today to talk about Turkey's response since the Iran-US-Israel war began on February 28th, 2026. I'm going to go over a few broad concepts of what Turkey's been doing in responses, and then get into the details of this defense coalition pact that Turkey has formed between Pakistan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, which may also include Qatar soon, as well as Turkey, as I mentioned. To start, Turkey has tried to remain neutral since the conflict began. Historically, Turkey usually stays out of regional wars as long as possible. When there's different states fighting, Turkey tries to stay neutral, stays on the sidelines. This was what we saw in the US war on terror. This is what it did in the 1980s during the Iraq-Iran war. And also, this was Turkey's policy in World War II until the very end. Turkey stays neutral, and that's what it's doing now. So there's no surprises in this stance that Ankara has taken. Ankara's focus when the war broke out was trying to stop it as soon as possible. They did a lot of mediation efforts, trying to tell Washington not to go ahead with it, avoid doing it now, because in Turkey's domestic politics, this war is very poorly timed. Turkey is heading into an election cycle, possibly next year in 2027. And obviously, high inflation has been a problem for many years in Turkey, and a war in the Gulf, where a lot of the energy resources come from, is raising energy prices, which were already high in Turkey. So obviously, the domestic implications are similar to other countries in Turkey and similar to other countries in the world. Turkey's priority since this began has been protecting airspace and NATO assets within Turkey. There are several bases used by NATO in Turkey, and there's also some radar equipment here, and those have been targeted or apparently targeted by missiles that seem to have been launched from Iran or Iran proxies that came into Turkish airspace, but were downed by NATO assets in the Mediterranean. So that means ships around Cyprus were shooting down missiles that were going towards Incirlik Air Base. That's what the trajectory looked like. We don't have the full details. This happened 3 or 4 times publicly. That's what we've heard. There may have been more, there may have been less. There's a lot of disinformation online and people claiming different kinds of infringements of airspace. The other priority of Turkey was protecting its borders. There was fears of a mass migration event if Iran was going to be attacked. A lot of the thinking here in Ankara was, what are we going to do if there's a rush for the Turkish border and many people want to flee the fighting? That didn't materialize, but it still could. And a lot of the state planning has been centered around keeping that mass migration flow near the border area. There's been different reports about which side of the border. There's some reports indicating Turkey would keep people on the Iranian side of the border or set up camps on the Turkish side. It's unclear. None of this was confirmed, but we haven't seen it yet. And I believe that policy would stay in place if there's a return or re-escalation of fighting. And as I said, protecting domestic political interests and protecting the economy is the main priority of the government because, like all governments, it's the economy that makes people decide at the ballot box, and that goes against incumbents if the prices are too high and the government's not taking the proper responses to lower prices, which is very difficult for all governments right now. To focus on that defense pact between Egypt, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, I'm going to lay out a few things that have been happening. The first meeting between the foreign ministers was on March 19th, 2026 in Riyadh, the Saudi capital. And then they had two subsequent meetings between the four foreign ministers, one in Islamabad in late March and one in Antalya, Turkey in April. During these meetings, the main focus is expressing support for Pakistan's mediation efforts. Pakistan has taken a central role in passing messages between the US and Iran. Turkey has done this as well. There's different actors in the region, but it seems like Pakistan has been more active on this front. When I ask people why this is the case, the responses we get are speculation, but it's usually that Iranian officials do not trust Turkish intelligence to transfer messages on the same level as they might trust Pakistanis or even the government in Oman, which is believed to be doing some mediation efforts between the US and Iran. This group is formed over the shared anxieties that Israel's aggression in the region uh, poses a threat to not just stability, but their own domestic interest. And, there's a lot of talk about Israeli territorial expansion. We see this with some border activities in Syria following the fall of Bashar al-Assad. So the rhetoric locally in Turkey is that Israel wants to expand further, and this could one day pose a threat to Turkey. Apparently, these are also the rhetorics in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, but I don't follow those because I focus on Turkey. The other thing that really pushed Saudi Arabia to join some kind of pact with Pakistan, so to start from the beginning, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan made a security pact in September 2025, and this came shortly after Israeli missiles targeted officials in Doha, Hamas officials in Doha, and this was kind of a breach of international norms at the time. There had not been direct Israeli strikes on Qatar at the moment until then, and Saudi Arabia thought, okay, we need to do something to push back on Israel's attitude in the region, and it formed that coalition with Pakistan. Turkey expressed interest in joining it. Nothing materialized of that. We just saw some news reports that there were talks. And then this year, following the full war between US, Iran, and Israel, we saw the four members come together and have quadrilateral meetings to try and just have some sway in regional events. And usually what you're hearing from Ankara officials like Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan is that the US is unreliable, it's pulling out, we don't understand its role in regional security, and we, as the main actors of this region, the main economies of this region and military powers, we need to take responsibility for stability in our region. That's the public rhetoric. It seems logical, and it seems to be expanding to Qatar because there's news just in these recent weeks that Pakistan is considering inviting Qatar to make it a five-member security pact. The thing that many people say is this also has a nuclear element to it. Israel is believed to hold nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And by having this balance of nuclear armed states, there is some kind of leverage to negotiate regional peace because nobody knows how this war is going to end or where it's going to go. And it seems that, power is essential in getting a say at the table, a seat at the table, let's say. So, what does this all mean? This could go in many different directions. The issue with having this quadrilateral formation is that all the countries involved have had foreign affairs problems in the past. Turkey and Saudi Arabia were rivals at one point in the last decade. Same with Egypt. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have had friction in the past. So analysts that focus on the dynamics between these countries often say that the calculations between the capitals can change quickly. And while they're in a partnership now, that doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to continue for a long time. Right now, they're joined by having opposition to Israel's actions. Once Israel's actions end in some form or de-escalate, maybe this coalition will fall apart, is what some people are saying. but it really depends on what happens and what course the US takes. For this moment, it seems like these are regional heavyweights that are trying to coordinate a response to geopolitical shocks. And for Turkey, which wants to be a kind of representative in the Muslim world, it's important to take part. Uh, it gives Erdogan that international credibility for voters. The question that we ask here in Ankara is whether there's going to be a rally around the flag moment when we go to the ballot box, when people start voting again in the next election cycle, because usually regional instability, war makes people back incumbents. But since the vote is a little bit, might be a year off, we're not sure. They might call snap elections before the deadline. We need to have elections here in before May 2028. So we're expecting a vote in November 2027, most people that follow Turkish politics. And we're wondering if that's going to be too far off from a de-escalation of this war to have that rally around the flag effect. And Erdogan will be stuck with the economic consequences of this war, which are likely to increase prices for the next year, if not more. So, I mean, it's a lot of variables, but for now, Turkey remains very stable, and that's because it's a NATO member, and we are waiting to see what comes next. I hope this is helpful. And once again, Diego Cupolo, Turkey Recap Editor-in-Chief. Glad to answer questions if anybody wants to reach out.